Hello and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. So this afternoon we are focusing on future livestock and we're specifically looking at climate change. So we're going to encompass all types of livestock, be it cattle, sheep, pigs and poultry. We've got a fantastic lineup of speakers for you this afternoon between SAC Consulting and SRUC staff. We've got quite a packed agenda, so it's going to be quick, sharp 20-minute talks from everybody, and then there's going to be plenty of time at the end for asking questions. So just to set the scene a little bit to why are we doing this today on climate change. So food production relies on natural processes, so it's inevitable there's going to be some greenhouse emissions from this. Scotland has got some beautiful landscape. We've got a really favourable climate, favourable rainfall and plenty area of permanent grass, which is really suited for livestock. If it wasn't for those livestock, there'd obviously be areas of bracken, rushes, gorse come up, and then that in turn starts to affect our economy, our tourism, our catering services. But we're challenged by policy, and policy is always changing. And this policy is very much driving change and a lot of different targets as well. So there's three kind of references there that have some fantastic information of where our policy is going. We've got an ambition by Scotland Food and Drink by 2030 that the income derived from food and drink will be doubled. But at the same time, we've got a challenge by 2045, a legally binding challenge, that we achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. By 2032, the agricultural sector should be adapted to low emission technologies to maximise efficiency while using minimal inputs to maximise the outputs, using precision farming, so that may be GPS, it may be new technologies in livestock. It's looking at application of nutrients, and as well as your fertiliser with your GPS, also your slurries and your farmyard's manures as well. And if you think about these targets, 2030 is only 9 years away, 2032 is only 11 years away, and 2045 seems a long way away at 24 years, but it's quite scary how 24 years catches up with you as well. So that's just a bit of context to what we're doing today. There's also a really, really good resource for you to have a look at in Farming for a Better Climate. I've got the website address here and we'll put it into the chat function of Zoom as well. And it's really a hub of information that's got practical ideas, different examples about how different farmers have reduced the impact of climate change. And I've just taken a bit of a screenshot here, and this is just one part of the website with the optimizing livestock performance and all the stuff that's there. You've got written documents, you've got podcasts, you've got videos, there's oodles and noodles there. So I'd really encourage you all to have a look on the website. There's also a Facebook and Twitter for Farming for a Better Climate that's well worth a follow as well. So without further ado, I'm going to pass on to our first speaker. I'm just going to stop screen sharing and let them take over the screen while I introduce them. So the first session is going to be a double act between Julian Bell and Robert Ramsay. So both of them work for SAC Consulting. Julian is a principal rural business consultant and he has a massive portfolio. He works in sustainability, markets, economics. He looks at arable, he looks at livestock. He has a mass amount of work. His main focus is reducing the carbon footprint in agriculture. Robert is a beef specialist with the SAC Livestock team, and his, again, role is very varied, but he focuses on improving beef productivity and profitability. So Robert, Julian, I'll hand over to you guys.
Thank you. Excuse me. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. And so Robert and I will start the presentations in terms of the initial starting points. I'll just share my slides. So thanks, Kirsten, for introduction. So I think just a quick bit of background. So my background is actually general sort of farm business. And I've actually worked on carbon since 2007, so that's quite a while. And what actually got it going was a business issue, which is the New Zealanders saying that they had lower carbon lamb than us. And but we looked at their figures, and they'd been a wee bit selective in the UK data that they'd used. So we started developing our own carbon calculator at that time. And actually, it's not gone away, but very recently, obviously, it's expanded in importance. So the focus of myself and Robert just now is to look at, what is the challenge for livestock to get to low carbon. I'm sort of coming out from a sort of business side angle with data that we've got from AgriCalc, our carbon calculator, and Robert's going to home in on some practical improvements in terms of beef and related areas. So, yeah, quickly, why the interest in carbon, where the emissions coming from, very briefly. What about mitigation? What sort of case studies, a few case studies here just to show the sort of improvements that could be possible on farm, and really what we're driving towards in the future. I think for the livestock industry, what's really raised the stakes locally, I suppose, in Scotland is this focus now on future support could well be conditional in many cases on farmers' improvements to cutting carbon emissions. So the first report came out, Jim Walker's Suckler Beef Climate Scheme report came out in October. There's other ones coming in dairy, sheep, and I think pigs and poultry at some point. So the whole idea is that rather than direct payments, farming payments and support will get shifted over time to, for farmers that are taking steps to cut carbon. There will be other areas, of course, like biodiversity, but one major part of this is if farmers are going to get continued support, they're going to need to demonstrate that. And we've already seen the capital grant scheme come in where so equipment that can reduce carbon emissions is getting supported by Scottish Government. So it's just starting, but obviously for a lot of the livestock sector, what the policymakers want from their support is going to be increasingly important. And just to say, if you look at the UK, very similar. These are targets to cut emissions. I think it's just to say this focus on net zero. I think agriculture is not actually being expected to get to net zero because of all the issues around methane and nitrous oxide. They're not easy nuts to crack. So agriculture is roughly expected to halve its emissions over that period for the UK. Of course, those targets may tighten, but it's just be aware that the net zero is not necessarily the driver of all this. I mean, it's obviously desirable, and there are sort of many livestock producers looking at this, but just be aware that the background is around about halving of emissions over that period. This just shows the growth in carbon that's gone through AgriCalc, our carbon footprinting tool, and just shows a rapid increase. Of course, we've had things like beef efficiency scheme and other schemes, but the wider interest in carbon footprinting is increasing. And we've touched on a few things in terms of business, whether it's the governments, the retailers, farms trying to improve their position with their buyers, the banks. There's actually money available for low carbon investment in livestock facilities, for instance, or other equipment at lower. There's big pools of money at lower interest rates in the city, and of course, technology is another area. Now, I've just pulled a bit of data out of AgriCalc. AgriCalc's the SRUC, SAC carbon footprinting tool, and it just shows you this is per unit of output. So you've got kilogram of beef or kilogram of or dead weight of lamb. You've got dairy, and you've got pigs and poultry. Now, land use change isn't in here, so it would roughly possibly double some of the sort of intensive pig and poultry emissions. But you can see where the emissions are coming from. Clearly, you've got methane. It's a big one in the cattle feeds and things in dairy particularly, but also in pigs and those other sectors. And we do see a big range in emissions across farms, and that's just an example from dairying. Easily half, many producers are easily half of others, or approaching half of the average in some cases. So huge variation in performance. And I think just the next few slides really just focusing on tackling this. In terms of farming, the producers, the subsidy is possibly going to get directed towards lower carbon. The market is there trying to say, look, produce lower carbon products. So the first point is where are your emissions coming from? Obviously that varies widely across sectors. As I say, in the sort of ruminant sector, clearly methane, but you've got feed, fertilizer, manures and things like that. So where are the emissions coming from? And really it's all about, there are improvements that can be made while we're waiting on maybe changes in support and all the rest of it. Most of these savings are going to actually cut carbon, but they'll also cut costs as well. So there's a whole range of practical measures which other speakers will be coming on to later. But just an example, this shows work we did for Scottish Government looking at the beef sector in support of Jim Walker's report. So we worked through a whole range of, for beef suckler finishers, we worked through a whole range of different things. Now, if you look at these individually, some of them don't seem to make too much difference. You think, well, there's 1 or 2% here. The figures on the right are cumulative, but some are only 1.5%, 2%. And you think, well, okay, that's quite a challenge. But when you start stacking them up, it's quite amazing what you can start to achieve. Well, we got to nearly 40%, high 30% here. Hypothetical situation, of course. Average farms obviously could perhaps only use some of these measures, but it just shows even if you can take half of these measures and make them work on an individual farm, 15–20% reduction is achievable. But it'll take a lot of different approaches, and every farm will be different. But that's the potential that we can be aiming for. This example, this is a dairy example, dairy farm, large dairy farm, Grosvenor Estate down in the Midland, Cheshire, and we worked with them to sort of look at what they'd done over the last few years. Whole host of things on the dairying side, genetic improvement, nutrition. They were actually making better silage. They sampled a lot of manures and slurries, made much better use of them. Sex semen actually had quite an impact. They're getting more valuable calves out of the herd. They actually got rid of soya and switched it for other ingredients. And that's to put in a PV plant. So these are all examples. And actually in the end, it cut their emissions by 16% over that 4-year period. Since then, they've actually made more improvements, and they've potentially got a similar reduction on the card. So it does show you where farms do commit to this, that they can make some big strides. But in this case, these were all cost benefits to the farm. I just want to raise quickly a couple of things, improvements or changes that we're bringing to the tool. One is soil carbon module. We've brought this in we're just sort of testing it out, but it'll be rolled out more widely soon. Essentially, we're trying to capture favorable steps that the farm is taking to improve soil carbon. And it's based on the IPCC method. Essentially, if a farm adopts a better practice in terms of soil carbon, that will be worked in over 20 years. That's the method that IPCC have said. And what we're finding with livestock farms, I've got a quick example next. If you're improving the grazing management, it's good for the grass, shorter grazing periods, longer rest periods, managing the stocking levels correctly. The manures make a big difference to improving organic matter, putting that back on. If there's some arable crops in rotation, having the temporary grass with the livestock in the rotation makes a really big difference to cutting carbon emissions on those mixed farms. So there's quite a lot of potential there. This is one example, just some results from a beef herd that we've looked at recently. And in their case, they had moved to a grazing system and put in more grass into the rotation, but that actually showed a useful 26% of their emissions were being offset by improving soil carbon. Now that wasn't going to last forever. There's this 20-year time period. but clearly we're at least showing the benefits of grazing livestock in the rotation. I think just moving towards the end here, we've kind of picked up these rules of thumb, looking at different farms. And what typically you say, if you start looking at the business, the way the farms run, 10 to 15% carbon savings are probably there for to make use of over the first 1 to maybe 3 years. And these are all just tweaking what you're doing, improvements, and there's a lot of benchmark you can do, just trying to farm a bit better. Now you might say, well, it must be easier for some farmers that are maybe a bit behind the curve, but actually we find good farmers can move more quickly. Okay, they've captured a lot of the gains already, but they'll look hard for others. And the more average sort of farmers will make improvements, but it may take them a bit longer. So these seem quite good rules of thumb. To go beyond that, and all those things should save the farm money or improve output. Beyond that, you're sort of saying, what else can we do? Well, give yourself another 2 or 3 years, another 15% potentially. So you're starting to look at maybe 25, 30% carbon reduction. And that's all you might have to invest. And of course, that's where the capital grant scheme and things are useful, but you will start to make improvements. Where it starts to get harder, when you start to move towards, these much bigger reductions, at the moment, we need some sort of financial incentives to help farmers do that, because you've got costs, you've got nitrification inhibitors, you might have new equipment, new machinery with intensive animals, you've got inhibitors for methane. These often have a sort of net cost. But there are some options on the table. It's quite hard to get to zero. It's very hard, but you can actually make a huge amount of progress. But as you push that harder, then some sort of mechanism is going to have to be there to help the farmers to achieve it financially. So I think a couple of the key things really, carbon is a very complicated issue, but it's actually a business issue. The governments are getting behind it in terms of support. The retailers are asking for it. They're not necessarily paying for it yet, but they are certainly asking for it. It pays to look at what you're doing and find any hotspots that you can improve. We start budgeting carbon just like money. Its value or it's growing all the time over the next few years. So I think for farmers to get a good grip of it and to work out where they can improve. And I think at the end of the day, the good message really, efficient farms can be low carbon farms. Productive agriculture can reduce carbon emissions, and there's plenty more steps industry can take. So yeah, there's a whole host of areas that the industry can look at. So it's probably really now time to pass on to Robert and the other speakers who look at other aspects of this. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Julian. I'll just ping up my fairly straightforward slides. Wait a minute.
Julian, just while Robert is getting his slides, there was some questions to you came in the chat. GWP 100 versus GWP.
Yes, we are looking at without. It will be an option in AgriCalc for users to apply the GWP star method, and I think it's going to make things more accurate for results on farms. So it's a really useful thing to look at. It's not actually accepted, as people know, just at the moment with IPCC, but the first step is for people to see what difference it might make to their own sort of farm. So we are adding it as an option later this year. So we'll be keen to see how people use that and what benefit or what changes it might give to their emissions.
Super, thank you.
Excellent. Cool. Thanks, Julian, and also a big thank you to Kirsten for asking me along today. So I'm Robert Ramsay. I'm a beef specialist with SAC Consulting. I very much have my foot in two camps. I've got the carbon end of things, but also more so the business end of things, so the financial end of things, because obviously we need a viable business to be in place in order to make alterations to carbon footprints as well. So I'm always trying to keep that business viability aspect in my mind as well. looking at carbon footprint, how do we improve the carbon footprint of the suckler cow? So this short presentation really just focuses on suckler cows, which are probably the group that get the most grief. They get the most, they get none of the credit for the good things that they do, and all of the grief for being inefficient methane, or very efficient methane producers, but not very efficient at everything else. That's not my thoughts, for the record. How do we improve the carbon footprint of the suckler cow? The answer to that is that farmers have been doing it, on an ad hoc basis themselves for generations, by trying to be more efficient, produce more productive animals, and be more profitable. We're actually making positive inroads into your carbon footprint. So when we're talking about things that are going to have, things have to change going forward, policy and where we're going, you have to keep in mind that this is nothing new and nothing really to worry about. Really, it's more of a structure to help us with where we actually want to get to ourselves. So today, you're going to see a lot of presentations from real scientists and things that are based on real equations. Certainly, Julian's AgriCalc system is full of equations, and they're all peer-reviewed and correct. This one is neither peer-reviewed nor correct, but I think it's quite a nice a thing to keep in mind when you've got carbon in mind. Actually put carbon to the side and bring money into it. So if we can make efficiency savings, if we can make decisions on farm that improve our bottom line, you're likely to have a significant impact on your carbon footprint as well. So carbon equals money. It's not quite as simple as that, but on a farm level, it pretty much is. And a quote that I've heard a few times now, I don't know who actually said it to start with, but I think it's a really good one, is that a business that's in the red can't be green. So actually that business that's making a loss is hemorrhaging money. It's also there's significant inefficiencies in that system that basically lead it to have a poor carbon footprint as well. So it's a win-win. If we can improve our carbon footprint, we can also improve our bottom line. So I'm actually talking tonight at a meeting about basically on this all night. So things we can do to improve the carbon credentials of your business. And we don't have long, but for me, as Julian said, at the entry level, which is where we're all at, I think marginal gains are the place that there's a huge amount of scope to make a big amount of progress in livestock businesses using marginal gains. So that's making small changes to multiple parts of your business. So if you can do a slightly better job on a number of fronts, you'll have you make a good difference to your carbon footprint and ultimately your bottom line as well. So the things we're looking at really are making improvements in diets, and to do that, obviously you need rations, but also improving forage quality. So or use of on-farm produced feeds as well. So producing a better quality feed. Soil health is becoming more and more important. We're developing a better understanding of soil health and its role in carbon sequestration as well. But from a business point of view, it's how to get soil in a position where it's performing to its optimum and producing everything we need it to produce. Grassland management is becoming a really hot topic. Rotational grazing, mob grazing, there's any amounts of ways of managing our grassland asset that we've got, and it certainly is the biggest asset we've got, our soil and our grassland, and making the most of it on farm is going to have a positive impact on your carbon footprint. Fertility, obviously that applies to soil, but particularly applies to your herd or herd flock or whatever enterprise you're running. Fertility is a really strong driver for profitability and also helps with carbon as well. Animal health planning, anything that reduces losses. So we're trying to improve outputs and reduce or minimize inputs. So if we can reduce bought-in feed, reducing days alive is something we could discuss at length. But if we can reduce those days to slaughter and have a more efficient path towards slaughter, we have a positive impact again on carbon footprint. Then all your inputs, fertilizer, electricity, fuel, pesticide, that list goes on and on. There's a lot we can do on those fronts. And as I say, if we can tick off a few of these, make a 1% reduction in some of these areas, we can make a cumulative pretty good positive result for your carbon footprint. The one I want to highlight is cow size. It's something we probably as an industry we need to look at, and before I go off on one, I'm not promoting that we go down a Jersey Cross Dexter route. It's really just looking at those particularly big cows in any herd that are, they're consuming more, they're producing more methane, they're consuming more feed, and they're not actually producing a great deal more kilos of calf, kilos of output. So that cow size, if we can drive down cow size in a kind of sustainable planned approach, there's some big wins in there, and that certainly helps with the reduction of inputs. The example would be you could carry 100 cows at 750 kilos or 116 cows at 650 kilos. So a reduction of 100 cows on 100 kilos on average allows you to produce hopefully 16 more calves on the ground. So as I say, plenty to discuss there, but certainly if we keep in mind carbon and money and producing a bit more from a wee bit less, that would be the plan. I just wanted to focus a wee bit on fertility. So fertility, certainly from a business point of view, if we can get more calves on the ground, the more calves we can get on the ground, the better. And there's low-hanging fruit here from a business perspective. This is some work done by Tim Geraghty, who's a colleague of ours, an SRUC vet from Aberdeen, and he's done a project here that was a group of farmers or farmer data put together, basically creating or pulling their 10 herds together to create 1,822 cows that were put to the bull, and from that we got 1,502 calves. And when you see it like that, it's 82%. Probably the industry average sits somewhere, depends who you ask, but sits somewhere between 80 and 90%. When you see that loss of 320 calves, you can see why we've got an issue with profitability in the suckler sector. And then if we pare it back again, if we look at where those losses actually occurred, you can see the role of fertility. So that the biggest loss in the system, or the biggest single loss in the system, is cows not getting in calves. So 8% of those cows failed to conceive. So actually, if we can make inroads into that, we can have it's a really powerful way of making more money, and does have some impact on your carbon footprint as well. We mourn the calf that's born in a bag or gets lain on or gets lost at calving time, scours, pneumonia, whatever it is. It really ruins your day. And actually, the empty cow at scanning time has a bigger impact on your business than the loss at calving time. So it's food for thought. Again, we could discuss this one all night, but certainly something to keep in mind. When we look at policy, it's always easy you look at policy and it's easy to see change being a bad thing. But actually in this case, looking at emissions, we've got a real challenge. We've got a huge job of work to do. But what's being proposed, certainly through the beef climate work that's been done and Farming for 1.5, there's a lot of support to incentivize us to get better at what we do, to produce more money. So in effect, we're going to get paid money to produce more money. So I think the future now is there's a real opportunity to supercharge a business. So we'll have subsidy income that comes in to reward us for actually making a bit more money. And for me, that's really quite exciting. And I make no apology for taking the carbon bit out and putting the money bit in, because it's the bit that really excites me, I suppose, is profitability and pound notes. So certainly the future is going to be different, but I think there's going to be a reward there for people who are keen to get on farm and do what they really want to do. So that concludes my talk. I'm conscious it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through options, but certainly happy to discuss in questions or even later on as well if somebody's interested.
Excellent. Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Robert. There's actually quite a few questions come in for you guys, but we'll just try and stay on track and move on to the next speaker, and then we'll have the questions at the end. So our next speaker is going to be Gemma Miller. Gemma is a postdoctoral researcher with SRUC's Beef and Sheep Research Centre. She has had an interest in climate change for many years and she's got an MSc in carbon management and a PhD in soil science. She's also got experience in forestry and peatland restoration, so she's an excellent speaker for you this afternoon. Her current research interests are in enteric methane mitigation strategies and development of precision livestock farming technologies. And she currently manages the Green Cow Respiration Chamber facility for SRUC as well. So Gemma, I will hand over to you, please.
Just share my screen. I wanted to talk to you today about there's a fellowship I did through Safari where in partnership with NFU Scotland, and I wanted to focus a bit on some of the myths around agriculture and greenhouse gas emissions that I came across while doing that fellowship. So just to start, as a bit of background, Safari, for those who don't know, is a Scottish Environment, Food and Agricultural Research Institutes who deliver the Scottish Government's strategic research plan for agriculture. And within Safari, so that's a collection of 6 research institutes across Scotland. SRUC is one of those, obviously. Within that, there's Safari Gateway, which is a knowledge exchange and impact hub for Safari. And they will fund specific projects for researchers who feed into the strategic research programme. And one of those funding streams are fellowships where researchers work in partnership with an external organisation to deliver a specific piece of work. So this fellowship was with NFU Scotland, and the remit was to summarise what is currently understood about agriculture emissions in Scotland and to communicate that information in a user-friendly way to key industry stakeholders. Part of that was firstly identifying the really contentious topics around and maybe some disagreement and to address those. Also to bring to the fore some topics. While I was gathering information on these topics, I came across several statements or arguments or things that were considered to be facts, which were really myths, partially myths. And I just wanted to talk. The first one was that grasslands are sequestering lots of carbon. Now, that would be true in parts of the world, and on a global level, is a sink of carbon in soils. But a lot of these are degraded soils where management is improved in soils. The soil carbon. Scotland, we're in the really fortunate position of having really organic, rich soils already. So we're already storing lots of carbon in soils. But soils aren't an infinite sink of carbon, so they have a saturation point whereby they can't store any more carbon. So even if you're putting lots more carbon inputs in, you're not actually gaining any sequestration because it's just being lost because the soil can't hold it. So there is a bit of a lack of evidence around grazing management in Scotland around carbon stocks. There was one long-term study in southeast Scotland, which was conducted by some of our SRUC colleagues, which found that over a sort of 7-year period, a typically managed grazed and mowed grassland had a steady state of carbon. So there was no carbon loss, there was no carbon gain, but the carbon stocks were stable. That's also quite a nice situation to be in because our soils are already quite organic and we're not losing any more. So that's a positive story really to come out of that. Also, in the greenhouse gas inventory, if a grassland has been a grassland for over 5 years, it no longer is assumed to be sequestering carbon. So even if that grassland soil is sequestering carbon, it's not being captured in the inventory. So that's the real weakness of the current greenhouse gas inventory. Something that we are kind of looking at, or is being looked at, biochar is a pyrolyzed.
Sorry, Gemma, you're dropping in and out a little bit. You're better when you're closer to the computer, so it might be worth just trying to come closer to the computer.
Better. So biochar is pyrolyzed organic matter, so plant material that has been heated up to really high temperature, and this makes the carbon really stable, so it's really difficult to break down for microbial decomposition. If we incorporate that into our soils, it will stay there for a long time and increase the soil. There are some potential co-benefits of doing this. So improving biochar may improve nutrient availability in soils. It has a liming effect, so it may reduce soil pH. It may also reduce NO2 emissions and increase water holding capacity. But we do need to have a lot more long-term studies are required in this area to sort of validate those findings. So the second myth it came up against was that grazing the uplands destroys the natural habitat. This may be true to an extent, but it's where there is excessive grazing. So we know around 59% of Scottish agriculture is rough grazing. And grazing does have an impact on the vegetation, so it can lead to the loss of peat-forming vegetation to more kind of shrubs and their shrubby and sedge-type vegetation that doesn't have such a high carbon sequestration potential as like your peatland mosses. There has been some studies that, it's not too many though. One study over a 100-year time frame showed that, or was predicted that over a 100-year time frame, excluding sheep or grazing at very low stocking density of less than 1 bag per hectare led to quite a large increase in carbon stocks of 14 tonnes per hectare, while stocking densities of 2.7 years led to a loss of 24 tonnes per hectare. So there is a balance that can be had there to allow carbon sequestration and grazing. And some studies have also shown that mixed livestock grazing, so both sheep and beef, can increase biodiversity. So there's definitely benefits to grazing on the uplands.
So planting trees is always good for the climate. So this isn't necessarily true. It's partly about where you plant your trees and getting the right trees in the right place. So it's sort of universally recognised that we should not be planting trees on deep peat, for instance, because that's a really rich carbon source. But shallow peats, sort of peat, with soils with peat layers less than 50 centimetres depth, are still acceptable for planting trees on. There are very few studies in Scotland or anywhere that have taken full account of the greenhouse gas balance of doing that. But when we look at the potential carbon gains of planting trees on shallow peats, because you get quite a big loss of carbon from the soil when you disturb it during tree planting, it can actually take 2 rotations before you get a net benefit of carbon sequestration. So we're talking 60 to 100 years before forestry on shallow peats has a net positive effect on the climate. And that's when we also need to take into consideration the wood products that are result from that as well to get that net benefit too. So yeah, as I said, the right tree in the right place. So what would the alternative land use be if you weren't going to plant trees on it? is the area providing habitat for plant animals? Will it affect the biodiversity of that area? And are there any other cultural or historical reasons that that area shouldn't be planted with trees? So there's a lot to take into consideration there when we think about planting trees as a climate change mitigation strategy. Yeah, okay, so there are some co-benefits of planting trees on more productive lands. So maybe planting trees on your improved grazing, so things like improving livestock welfare by providing shelter belts, which can increase your livestock's productivity, increasing crop yield by reducing soil erosion and preventing nutrient runoff, and also creating areas for wildlife in amongst your more productive land. The fourth myth I want to cover was enteric methane is part of a natural biogenic cycle. So this is true. It's something we need to be careful about because it can lead to the conclusion that we should be reducing our ruminant numbers. So this is partly driven by how we account for methane as a greenhouse gas. And the diagrams here were developed by Oxford University, and this is part of the Global Warming Potential STAR method for greenhouse gas accounting. So when we increase CO2 emissions, because they have a long residence time in the atmosphere, so they'll stay in the atmosphere for up to 200 years. As we increase emissions, the concentration of CO2 increases greater than linearly, so we end up with CO2 accumulating in the atmosphere at a much greater rate. But as we increase methane emissions, which has a residency time of around 12 years, it just increases at pace. So it's not accumulating as fast as carbon dioxide. If we have constant emissions of CO2 and methane, the concentration of CO2 will keep accumulating in the atmosphere while the methane emissions will stay constant. But if we reduce these emissions, CO2 will keep increasing up to a point and then the concentrations will remain high. But if we reduce the methane emissions, the concentration of methane in the atmosphere will drop quickly. And that's a really big win for climate change mitigation because we can cut the impact on the climate quite quickly just by reducing ruminant numbers, if we look at it that way. Of course, Scotland is really quite dependent on livestock production and agriculture, and we've got an ideal climate for producing good quality meat in this country, so we don't really want to be looking at that in those terms. But there are lots of other ways that we can reduce methane emissions, and I think that these were touched on in the previous presentation, so I won't dwell on them too much here. One thing that I'd like to bring before is testing forage, though. So if we can improve the quality of our grasslands, we can increase the productivity of our animals, reducing the methane emissions, but also improving biodiversity and all those other things as well. So that there's lots of wins for having good grassland management and increasing the quality of forage. Fifth myth and final myth I'm going to cover is methane is agriculture's biggest problem. Now, it is the biggest source of emissions from agriculture, but 81% of Scotland's nitrous oxide emissions come from agriculture, and that's a huge problem. And nitrous oxide doesn't really get very much media attention. It has it's 1 tonne of nitrous oxide is equivalent to about 298 tonnes of carbon dioxide, so it's got a huge impact, and it also has a really long residency time, so it's a really important greenhouse gas emission. So there's lots of things we can do to reduce this. Timing of your fertilizer applications is really important, so we want to avoid wet weather and add to that fertilizer when it's at its most needed by the plant at the time it's most needed by the plant, and that might involve splitting the application to coincide with different parts of the plant life cycle, and matching your crop requirements. So testing your soil is really important, knowing the nutrient status of the soil and applying your fertilizers or manures appropriately, and that can also save you money in the long run too. We can further reduce emissions by using potentially nitrification inhibitors, which limit the amount of nitrogen available in the soil to be lost to the atmosphere through various microbial processes. The results of using those are a bit variable, and they can be sensitive to weather conditions and soil types. And yeah, it can also lead to increased ammonia leaching from the soil. So it's means that you'll get nitrous oxide emissions further down the line just because you've lost nitrogen from that system. And also storing manure appropriately can reduce that as well. The biggest problem with storing manure is the indirect emissions, so ammonia and emissions from that, and yeah, so that nitrogen gets deposited elsewhere and causes a nitrous oxide emission further down the line. So you want to reduce your storage time, but that can be a bit at odds with applying your fertilizers at the right time, because yeah, those things don't always coincide. Again, a bit of a balancing act to be had there. So yeah, the fellowship with NFUS was really productive. It resulted in a whole lot of outcomes, some publications online, some articles, and some conversations. So it was really worthwhile, and it led. We're building on that. NFUS have created their climate change advisory panel, which is sort of steering agriculture towards net zero emissions. So that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gemma. And sorry, everybody, about the sound there. If there is anything you're not sure of, then please just pop it into the Q&A, and then we can address that towards the end with Gemma. So thank you very much for that, Gemma. Next up, we're going to move to Nicola Lambe, where she's going to speak about Project Grass to Gas. So Nicola has had a vast amount of experience working on sheep research projects, investigating improvements in carcass and meat quality alongside production and reproductive traits, considering both hill and terminal sire breeds. Nicola was actually my mentor for my dissertation 15, 16 years ago, so I always really enjoy working alongside Nicola. Her recent projects have focused on measurement of and genetic selection for new traits, including methane emissions and feed efficiency. So Nicola, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thanks, Kirsten. So I just want to talk today about a project that we have looking at strategies to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions from pasture-based sheep systems. So there's been less research in this area on sheep than in beef or dairy. And this project is trying to aim to address that. So the project is an ERANET project, so it involves a lot of different countries in the EU and beyond, and there's 7 countries involved shown down the bottom there. So there's the UK, France, Ireland, Norway, Turkey, New Zealand and Uruguay. And the objectives of the overall project are to validate predictors of feed intake and feed efficiency in sheep, and also predictors of methane emissions, and to determine relationships between feed efficiency measured indoors and outdoor at grazing, and to compare methane production indoor versus outdoors, and then to look at how feed efficiency and methane production are related to each other, both indoors and outdoors. We want to investigate genetic and genomic strategies to reduce methane from pasture-based sheep systems, and then look at quantifying economic and environmental benefits. And the overall aim is to combine expertise across these countries to deliver applied sustainable solutions to reduce methane emissions from sheep. So there's quite a lot of partners involved, and these are both academic and industry partners. So in the UK, SRUC are the lead, and the Texel Sheep Society are also involved as an industry partner. So when we're considering the phenotypes that we want to research within this project, we've focused on two really. So the two traits that we're interested in are feed efficiency and methane emissions. And there's various ways that these can be measured and are going to be measured within the project. So for feed efficiency, indoor feed efficiency, there's now some fancy automated feeders that can record feed intake at the individual animal level. Or some of the partners are using individual pens, just recording feed in and feed out an individual animal level. And then there's some techniques for measuring feed intake outdoors. So looking at N-alkanes, for example, where you can dose animals with N-alkanes and then analyze the feces to predict feed intake. Some of the partners are also looking at sensors and bite meters to look at feed intake or to predict feed intake outdoors. And another partner is looking at near-infrared spectroscopy of feces. And there are other techniques that are out there in the literature, but these are some of the ones that we're concentrating on in the project. And then in terms of methane emissions, the gold standard is really still the respiration chambers, but there's some other techniques that we're going to test within the project to see if we can measure methane or predict methane emissions accurately. So looking at things like portable accumulation chambers or hoods, so things like the green feeders that take point measurements of methane emissions, for example, when the sheep go in to feed. And I'll explain a bit more about portable accumulation chambers in a later slide. One of the other ways of predicting methane emissions that we're looking at within the project is considering rumen volumes. And there's some other techniques such as looking at the rumen microbiome and using predictors from that to look at methane emissions. And there are also measurements like the SF6 kit that can be used outdoors to capture methane from grazing sheep. So the two that I'm going to focus on more in this talk are the use of automated feeders and the use of rumen volume as a methane predictor. And these are two of the techniques that we've been working on a bit within SRUC in our research to date. So this is some of the kit that we have at SRUC for recording individual feed intake in sheep. So this is kit that we've had for 2 or 3 years now, and we can get individual animal information on intake of forage or concentrates, and also we have water drinkers that can record individual water intake as well. So they work with the EID tags in the animal's ear, and every time the animal goes in for a feed, we get a record on a spreadsheet of the amount of feed they've eaten in that meal and the duration of the meal. And the kit that we have at SRUC is mobile, so we can pack all this up onto trailers and move it between sites. You probably wouldn't want to do it every couple of weeks, but there is potential to move it between sites. So this is one of the modules set up in our shed at the Hill and Mountain Research Centre at Kirton. So we have water crates that you can see at the back there, and these have weigh platforms in the bottom, so every time the animals go in for a drink, we also get a live weight record from each animal. We have 2 concentrate crates that can be set to give animals different amounts of feed or to record how much they're eating if you wanted to feed them ad lib. And we also have 16 roughage troughs in this module. And we can feed things like grass nuts through this, and this is what we're concentrating on in the Grass to Gas project, using a roughage-based diet of grass nuts fed ad lib to look at individual feed intake. So some results from our pilot trials with this kit. The first trial we did just a small number of lambs, so there was just 23 lambs using the kit. And we wanted to see if there was variation between animals in the amount that they were eating, and then relate that to their growth rates as well. So this graph shows daily dry matter intake of both roughage and concentrates per lamb. And this was over a number of weeks. This was the average daily dry matter intake. And then when we look at that against average daily live weight gain, we can see there was a lot of variation between lambs. And the most extreme lambs, there was a twofold difference in the amount of dry matter intake per unit of growth. In another trial, we used 120 finishing lambs in the feed intake equipment, and they were mixed breeds, so they were half Scottish Blackface and half Clins, all mixed together in the pen. And from the data, we could see how much each of the breeds were eating on an individual animal level. So the Scottish Blackface animals ate more per day, but had slightly slower daily live weight gain, which means that they had a higher feed conversion ratio. So the Clins were more efficient at producing growth from feed. So we're going to take some of these protocols and techniques forward into our grass to gas project. And in the first work package, we'll be looking at validating predictors of feed intake and methane emissions. So in our trial in Scotland, we're going to be looking at lambs in this year and next year. Originally, it was meant to be last year and this year, but that's been delayed a year because of COVID. So these lambs are Texel Cross Scotch Mule lambs that have been born at our Barony farm down in Dumfries, and they'll be moved up into the feed intake equipment at weaning. So there'll be 125 lambs per year over the 2 years recorded through the kit. And we'll give them a forage-based diet, so we'll feed them on grass nuts, and we'll look at feed intake and growth over the period that they're in there. So we usually reckon it takes about 2 weeks to train the animals to use the equipment, and then we have a 6-week recording period to calculate their daily dry matter intake and growth rates. And we'll also be scanning the lambs before and after the test period, so using both ultrasound scanning and CT scanning to look at changes in body composition, and that'll be used for our feed efficiency calculations. And we'll also be looking at CT measured rumen volumes as a potential predictor of methane emissions, which I'll explain in the next slides. So we'll also be taking measurements of growth and feed quality throughout the 6-week period of test. And the aim is to develop prediction equations for feed efficiency. So the measurements that I mentioned, looking at CT rumen volumes as a methane predictor, this really came from work that had been done in New Zealand and Australia. And in these countries, they've developed selection lines for methane emissions. So they have high and low methane emission lines of sheep. And they found that when they CT scanned the lines, there were differences in the rumen morphology between the high emitters and the low emitters. And in general, those with bigger rumens produced more methane. And this fits with other results from the literature as well. So having a CT scanner at SRUC, we wanted to turn that on its head and see whether we could measure CT rumen volumes with the CT scanner and whether that could then predict methane emissions. So we did some work on this in our Scottish Government funded research programme. And another question we wanted to ask were, are these predictors under genetic control? So is this something that could be used within a breeding programme potentially? So the first trial we did, we took mature Scottish Blackface ewes, we CT scanned them and measured their rumen volumes from the CT scan images. And then we put these sheep into our respiration chambers at the Green Cow unit at Edinburgh. And we related their rumen measurements to their methane outputs. And we found that when we looked at methane either as grams per day or grams per kilo dry matter intake, we saw strong relationships between CT rumen volumes and methane emissions. So this confirmed the relationships that have been found in the other studies. And then because we've been CT scanning lambs to look at body composition for over 20 years now, we have a huge archive of CT images from previous research trials and from commercial CT scanning of sheep. So we looked at one study that we'd done in the past, where we'd looked at a hill breed, the Scottish Blackface, and a terminal sire breed, the Texel. We'd grazed them together on low ground pastures and compared them. The original idea in the project was to look at differences in body composition and meat quality, but we used the scan data to then go back and measure rumen volumes and to compare them between the breeds. And we found that when we compared the two breeds at either the same age or the same live weight, the Scottish Blackface hill lambs had much larger rumens than the Texels. And even within breed, there were differences between sires. So the bottom graph there shows the average mean for each of the sire for their progenies rumen volumes after we'd adjusted for live weight. So there were sire differences as well as breed differences in rumen volumes at the same live weight. So we used another data set to investigate this further. We had data from commercial Texel ram lambs that had been CT scanned as part of the National Breeding Programme. So we used data from the most recent 3 years, so that was from about 650 lambs, and we looked at their rumen volumes and did a genetic analysis and found that it was moderately heritable. So this suggests that there may be potential for genetic selection within breed if this is something that we think is the right thing to do. But at this point, we probably have to take a step back and think whether this is the right thing to do to select sheep with smaller rumens. And we would have to look at genetic relationships with other economic and environmental traits. So looking at the literature, generally methane emissions do tend to be favourably correlated with carcass traits like lean meat yield and dressing percentage. But there is information in the literature that sheep that produce less methane are less efficient at digesting fibre. So this is interesting considering our results from the hill versus the terminal sire breeds, that the ones with the bigger rumens were the animals that were adapted to grazing poorer quality vegetation in a hill environment. So we probably have to consider different priorities in different production systems before we go down the route of genetic selection for rumen volume. So within the Grass to Gas project, we want to further understand these relationships between rumen function, methane emissions, feed efficiency and production. And we're conscious that we have to look across different types of sheep systems. So within the second work package in Grass to Gas, the aim is to compare indoor and outdoor feed efficiency and methane emissions. So we're concentrating on the feed efficiency side of that in our UK trials. So in the same trial that we'll be using the Texel Cross mule lambs indoors, we'll also be using their siblings to graze on pasture and for a comparison between indoor and outdoor feed efficiency. So we're going to be using sets of twins and splitting the twins, have one twin in the indoor equipment and one twin grazed on pasture outdoors. And from the grazing group, we won't be able to record individual feed intake, but we'll be able to look at grazing offtake across the group and look at growth, body composition and CT rumen volume. And then we can compare lambs indoors and outdoors. The third work package is focused on genetics to reduce methane emissions. And in our quite limited trial, we do have some scope to look at genetics, although we can't do a full genetic analysis. The lambs that we're using, so the 250 per year, half of which will be indoors and half outdoors, they're sired by performance recorded Texel sires. So the Texel Sheep Society have provided these sires, and they come from a range of they have a range of EBVs and index values and have strong genetic links to the national population. So we are going to be able to identify if there's any differences in feed efficiency due to sire, or their breeding values or index values. And some of the other partners within the project actually do have selection lines for methane emissions or feed efficiency or one of the partners at INRA, they're looking at divergent lines for parasite resistance as well, and how that relates to feed efficiency and methane emissions. And some of the other partners are using more direct measurements of methane emissions, and 4 of the partners are using these portable accumulation chambers that I mentioned before. So in Uruguay, the top left picture here with the perspex boxes, this is the kit in Uruguay. And then in Ireland, they're using portable accumulation chambers that can be moved around on a trailer. So they can be taken out to the field for measurements as well. And then in Norway, their chambers are housed on a lorry. Here you can see at the bottom, and they can take that lorry round and measure sheep either indoors or at pasture. And how these work is they take a measurement of methane of the animals. So the animals are only in these small boxes individually for about 50 minutes at a time, and they're recorded twice on 2 occasions, 2 weeks apart. And this gives a good point estimate of methane production, which has been validated against respiration chambers. And it's also useful because you can measure sheep straight off grass as well. So this will give us some of our answers to our questions relating outdoor methane emissions to those measured indoors and to feed efficiency. So in my opinion, this is probably one of the methods that's most likely to provide information that can be used in a breeding program. So you can measure quite a lot of animals through this sort of kit compared to traditional respiration chambers, and the results seem to be very accurate at predicting methane emissions and for ranking animals across populations. So the final work package is looking at economic and environmental benefits, and this will be done by our colleague Michael McLeod, who's a social scientist. He'll take the results from work packages 1 to 3 across the partners and use economic and environmental modelling tools to quantify the effects of the most promising strategies that have been identified. So looking at outputs, gross margins and greenhouse gas emissions. And he'll look at the cost effectiveness of the different genetic or genomic strategies that have been suggested, and also life cycle analysis to identify any potential trade-offs. So just to conclude, the Grass to Gas project is looking at some of the most promising tools that are being developed to measure traits related to greenhouse gas emissions from sheep systems. And particularly, we want to identify something that can be used within a breeding program to try and breed for lower methane emissions. And I think that really the international collaboration in these sorts of projects is key to moving things forward. So a lot of the kit is very expensive to buy and difficult to operate and install, but having these sorts of collaborative projects avoids duplication of research effort and research funding. It pools the expertise, and we're all swapping protocols and methodology. And ultimately then it accelerates industry implementation. And really it's a global problem that requires a global solution. So working together should hopefully provide an accelerated response to some of these problems. So just like to thank our funders and collaborators, and thanks for listening.
It's amazing to see some of the tools and technologies that there is in place. So thank you for that, Nicola. Okay, we're going to move on to our final section for the day. So we're moving on to pigs and poultry, and we're looking at alternative sources of protein for pigs and poultry. So Jos Houdijk is going to join us. Jos originates from Holland. He obviously is now with SRUC in Edinburgh, and he heads up the Monogastric Science Research Centre and is a professor of animal nutrition and health. He has a wide and vast work package. He looks at various different factors, but his main kind of research place is alternative protein sources for pigs and poultry to reduce the reliance on imported soya. So Jos, I'll hand over to you.
Okie doke, thank you very much. Let me try to find my screen. Okay, so welcome to this talk about alternative protein sources for pigs and poultry. So something different from looking at the ruminants that we've been looking at so far. So we have to recognize that the pigs and poultry are very much reliant on imported protein sources when it comes to protein nutrition. And the main one that we're thinking then about is soybean meal. Let's always start a little bit as to think as to why are we actually so reliant on soybean meal? And it's from a nutritional point of view, soya is an excellent nutritional value. It's great palatability and a year-round availability. And that means a lot in the feed industry. But we know about the concerns of our reliance to soya. It comes with an environmental footprint associated to land use chains where it is being produced, but also associated to feed miles. You will have heard of food miles, but also feed comes with its transport cost from that point of view. Increasingly, we have to consider economic constraints as well. Economic constraints because there are other people around the world who are wanting to use soya, especially in the Asian countries. So the question has become, what are possible homegrown alternatives for soya? And over the last couple of years, we have been actively looking into, can we use legumes and rapeseed meal as an alternative? And legumes and oilseed rape, which ultimately produces the rapeseed meal, can be readily grown in Scotland. And I have here a couple of pictures from Robin Walker of experimental plots of peas, beans, and lupins in the north of Scotland, either as a sole commodity or intercropped with barley. In that same experiment, Robin also tried to grow soya. And I think we have to agree that that's probably not very effective. Therefore, we're looking at alternatives for soya in the forms of legumes and oilseed rape. And in these projects, we have revisited the nutritional value and then asked the questions, what kind of limits can we establish when feeding these alternatives instead of soya? Because it's not the first time that these commodities are being used, but in the industry, these upper limits may have been out of date. So that was one of the drivers. And we also had the possibility to be involved in some projects where we had novel legume co-products. And I'll tell a little bit about two of those projects as well. So it's a series of 5 projects that I briefly want to bring up, only 1 or 2 slides per project. I will not dwell too much longer on this slide as each of them will come in the next couple of minutes. So the first one is our Green Pig project from a couple of years ago now, where we used a series of small-scale and large-scale studies in order to identify potentially whether there is an upper limit in the levels of peas and beans that are being fed to pigs, to see if potentially there is a level over and above which the performance reduces. But much to our surprise, we could replace in our small-scale trials literally all the soya in our growing and finishing pigs without impacting performance at all. Of course, that was at a relatively low scale. So the project allowed us also to scale the trials up to a larger scale work. And in that larger scale work, here on the left side, you see a graphic that shows how we used various different types of pulses. We saw different types of beans and also a specific pea variety. And we really didn't see that much of a difference. If anything, we saw an overall improvement in feed conversion ratio. So that encouraged us to go to an industry scale wide experiment using 1,200 pigs which were fed from 30 kilo to slaughter, either on a soya diet, a pea diet, or a fava bean diet with all the soya removed. And to cut a long story short, we did not see any significant difference between the feeding treatments. And that was extremely positive outcome, of course. During that project, we had the possibility to debunk a couple of myths. And one of the myths that has been going around in the pig nutrition and pig producing industry for many, many decades is that feeding high levels of peas and beans will increase the risk of boar taint and will get the pig's feces very loose and resulting in diarrhea. And of course, that's not what we want. So during the trials that we did, we had the possibility to try to take some samples from either the animals or from the feces and to see if we could address these concerns. So we measured back fat, scatol, and indole, which are indicators for boar taint, and we measured the dry matter contents in the feces. What you see here on the left side is our dose response trial that we did in SRUC, and we actually could not find any indication that these indoles and scatols increase. If anything, they were decreasing. We repeated some of the work with our partners at Nottingham University, and they also failed to observe a detrimental effect. So based on our data, we had to conclude that pulsers have no risk of increasing boar taint. If anything, there is a slight reduction. The more contagious matter that farmers kept on coming back to me to say that too high levels of peas and beans give scouring and dirty pigs. We tested an enormous amount of fecal samples for dry matter, and we actually came to the conclusion that there is no indication of reduction in dry matter, so no indication of risk of scouring. If anything, the dry matter was increased. So in this project, we therefore have debunked some of these myths, which was extremely useful for the industry as a take-home message going forward. A second project that was building on from that green project looked at the use of fava bean fractions. We were fortunate to be part of a project where we worked together with the salmon feed industry, and a possibility to take fava beans as a commodity and split that into two different fractions. One, a more protein-rich fractions, which the salmon boys wanted to use for their salmon feeding. But then there was a co-product that was relatively rich in starch, but also still a decent amount of protein. And we looked at SRUC about the nutritional value of that commodity. We used both broilers and pigs to establish the nutritional value in terms of the levels of digestible amino acids, because ultimately that is what within the monogastric feeding industry is the key criterion for feed formulation. And we found that commodity had a digestibility between 70 and 90% for the individual amino acids. And we use that information to formulate diets optimally to include as high as possible this starchy co-product from this fractionation. And we fed that to pigs. And in that specific study, which you see the outcome briefly over here, we had inclusion levels going all the way up to 30%, and in that way completely removing all the soya in the diet. And I think you will agree to me that these lines are quite horizontal, which essentially means that there is no impact on average daily gain and no impact on feed conversion ratio, which is exactly what we wanted to see. So also these kind of legume fractions have the potential to reduce our reliance on soya. A third project looked at rapeseed, and rapeseed in the rapeseed world, the varieties of rapeseeds change on a regular basis because there are probably about 20 odd varieties being grown in the industry, and while some stay on for longer than others, there is generally a change of the variety as the commodity as a whole. So looking back at feeding data from 20, 30 years ago probably doesn't tell us enough about the current variety. So in this project, we had the opportunity to prepare small batches of rapeseed meal by shipping rapeseed from the UK all the way to the south of France, where there is a pilot plant to make rapeseeds small batches. And these were being used in both chickens and in pigs. We used chickens to establish the nutritional value of these commodities. And we saw a decent amount of variation in both energy and amino acid digestibility. And we made use of that variation to select two contrasting varieties and scaled it up with our partners and undertook a grower trial in both pigs and broilers. And what you see in this graph is the results from the pig work, but I'll talk about the broiler work in words. What you see on the bottom left side is increasing the levels of rapeseed meal and as a consequence reducing soya. And I think we should all agree that that is quite a straight line. So in our finisher pigs growing from 60 kilos to slaughter, we can remove all the soya and replace that with rapeseed meal. For the growers who are a bit more sensitive to some of the plant secondary metabolites in the rapeseed, we still have an upper inclusion level to consider there. So at levels of 50% and above, we did see a reduction in body weight gain. So that is something to consider. But for finisher pigs, bring it on. In the broiler trial that was done, we saw that although broilers responded a bit negatively to increasing levels of rapeseed meal, at 10% rapeseed meal, they were still performing well above the target. So even there is significant room for inclusion. Moving swiftly over to current work that we're doing with faba beans in broilers. What you see here is another dose response experiment where we increase the faba bean inclusion up to about 20%, so 200 grams to the kilo, and gradually reducing the amount of soya. And much to our surprise, what we saw was that the inclusion of faba beans actually improved the body weight gain and feed conversion, body weight gain on your left side and feed conversion on your right side. And feed conversion, remember that if it is lower, it means it's better. We were not expecting this improvement. So in the absence of beans, these chickens actually didn't do too well. Now, this was a trial where the starter feed was a meal rather than a crumb. And it was also a trial where we did not use in-feed coccidiostats. So we wondered whether some of these factors were underlying the effects that we observed. So just before lockdown, we completed a trial where we tested to see whether this effect of bean inclusion was perhaps due to the starter meal rather than using a starter crumb and to the coccidiostats present or not. This is a rather complicated slide here, but what you see on the left side is the final body weight at day 37 of the trial, and on the right side you see the feed conversion ratio. On the x-axis you have the starter feeding treatment, so chickens were either fed a meal or a crumb with coccidiostats, And then from 11 days until end of trial, they were fed either a soya diet, a diet with 15% faba beans, or a soya diet with coccidiostat. The long story, to cut the long story short here, is that we failed to observe any difference between faba bean rich diets and faba bean absent diets at 15% inclusion. What we did see was that if the starter is a meal, then there is a lack of response that is not compensated for later in the trial. So this essentially confirmed to us that 15% of faba beans is certainly attainable in the chickens. The last glimpse of some very first data I would like to bring about here is from a current EU project, where we are fortunate to pair up with a local brewer who has been experimentally designing a new beer. And in beer, where malted barley is usually the main driver, the main starch provider, if you like, he replaced 30% of the barley with faba beans in order to try to see if we can make alternative use of the faba beans. And the beer that was produced is very tasty, and it's been sold on many festivals at the Fringe, etc., for a couple of years now. But out of the products of brewery, we get a co-product, and that is the spent barley. And in this case, is the spent barley beans. And we asked ourselves whether this spent barley beans could be a useful feed source for broiler chickens. So we dried the spent barley beans and we fed it to chickens in a digestibility trial, where we compared the nutritional value of the spent barley beans with that of barley and dehulled beans, but also with that of soya and native beans, so beans that were not dehulled. The outcome you see in this slide on the graphic on the right side, and what you see here is that the spent barley beans has a nutritional value in terms of the digestibility of its amino acids that is only ever so slightly less than that of soya, but certainly much more than that of barley. And that suggests to us that knowing the digestibility of this commodity, we can now start to make use of this commodity to see how much we can feed, and hopefully in a subsequent project we are able to do so. What this slide also shows is that the dehulling of faba beans improves the nutritional value, and that is kind of a confirmation that the nutritional value from faba beans is very much constrained by aspects in the hull, and that's probably the condensed tannins. So at the end of this visual tour, I would like to say as take-home message from all this work that provided that commercial availability of peas and faba beans can be overcome, the commercial constraint can be overcome. I would say for the poultry and pig industry, bring it on. In my view, and also of our commercial partners, they are viable home alternatives to reduce our reliance on soybean meal, provided that we use nutritionally balanced diets. I showed you some of the examples in the fattening pigs, where we really have been able to omit all the soya, and in the broilers, we certainly can get a significant reduction. A couple of years ago, when this kind of work started, we undertook a life cycle assessment in order to get a feeler as to what does this mean in terms of improvement of environmental footprint, what kind of reduction in global warming potential do we see. And on the basis of the data from about 10 years ago now, we concluded that for the pigs, that was a 20% reduction in global warming potential. And I would like to see an opportunity to revisit that and to see if the current data can also tell us that we are on the winning streak from that point of view. So thank you very much for all the funders that have contributed to this work, and the many people that have been involved with the risk of potentially missing somebody, but I've listed them over here. And last but not least, I would like to thank you for your attention and happy to deal with any questions in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jos. If you could just stop sharing your screen, we'll get all the panelists back and put their cameras on, please. Jos, you're in the firing line since you've got your camera on at the minute.
That's fine.
And
that's
then
fine.
I'll give you a break, I promise.
That's
There's
okay.
a
No
question
worries.
in for you from Ian. What did you remove from the diet to add the 15% faba beans?
What I removed from the diet was a bit of the soya, but also a slight change in the wheat to oil ratio in order to make sure that the diets were isoenergetic. We have to recognize that soya has a much higher level of digestible amino acids. So I cannot say 50% beans in, 15% soya out. That would be great. The impact is slightly less there. The other kind of small changes I made was in the background wheat and oil fractions.
Thank you. One more for you, then I'll let
That's
you
fine.
be quiet.
Bring it on.
Are you saying rapeseed oil is not a viable option? Question from Graham.
Rapeseed oil is not something that we tested, but rapeseed meal is something that we tested. And the rapeseed meal for the fattening pigs is certainly a viable option to reduce reliance on soya. For the growing pigs, the outcome is that there is still this upper level of inclusion to consider, over and above which we get a reduction in performance, which is likely the consequence of a greater sensitivity of the growing pig to glucosinolates, which is the main anti-nutritional factor. In chickens, we saw although we saw a reduction in performance, the chickens were still very much performing well above target. In my view, there is probably room for about 10% of rapeseed meal in chickens as well. In the wider market, if chickens grow slightly less, that's actually what consumers want nowadays as well. So that's in that way, our homegrown protein sources can also help to meet that request.
Super, thank you.
Thank you.
Julian, it's been a long time since we've heard your voice. I'm going to make sure you're wide awake. And we've got a question here for you from Celine. Government might require a reduction in livestock numbers, just as arable farmers are struggling to let go of high yield to embrace high profitability. Will farmers be ready to reduce numbers?
Well, this is maybe where farmers and government slightly diverge, because I think we'd generally be encouraging to have the optimal number of livestock for the land in terms of productivity. And I think we're finding out whether it's some of the animals or some of the pasture that's been grazed isn't actually contributing very much. So some reduction. I mean, we've seen that already. Obviously, we've seen the animals come off the hills to some extent. So I think the farmer's point of view, fewer animals might not actually cut output, particularly might improve certainly profitability. But obviously, there's a limit to. From the policymakers' point of view, obviously less animals is probably quite good. But what we are supporting is that if you can concentrate on the more productive animals, or those animals doing a job for some other reason like biodiversity, but just cutting animal numbers, I mean, it's obviously a simple way of cutting emissions, but it doesn't really solve the problem of providing the food that's required.
Did I come in on that one as well, Kirsten?
Yeah.
I have a big concern on a business basis, a business by business basis of reducing numbers, in that the suckler job particularly is very fixed cost heavy. So you've got the biggest challenge to us is a fixed costs in a business. If we put, if we reduce cow numbers by 20%, the fixed costs stay the same. So the actual overall profitability of that business, it's catastrophic putting cows down the road. So I think, as Julian said, putting unproductive animals down the road and encouraging that reduction of unproductive animals is really important. But certainly, I'll nail my colours to the mast that reducing cow numbers isn't a sustainable way on a business by business basis. Reducing cow numbers isn't the sustainable way of, the worry is you force a reduction in cow numbers and actually everyone stops keeping cows because we're not in business.
And that creates a whole new set of problems.
Yeah.
I think this is probably a Robert question from Alistair. Where do you see the role of genomics and breeding indexes to cut emissions and drive efficiency and productivity?
So I think I can start it. I think there'll be other people who are better placed, but there's no doubt genetics, genomics have got a huge role to play in the future. The one example, I suppose, there's loads of work happening in Scotland, out with in Ireland and all over the place. The stabiliser breed, I find quite an interesting breed to watch what they're doing. They're certainly not for everybody, but they've focused really, really heavily on feed conversion efficiency, on profitability and emissions. And they've made a huge amount of progress in a pretty short period of time. And the interesting bit, just going back to what I was saying earlier, is they've actually created quite a profitable suckler cow as well. So they've managed to create that low input, high output type system that works really well. So I think of all the tools we've got in the armoury, I think all the genetic tools we've got are some of the most important.
Nicola,
can I add to that?
Yeah.
Yes, we see the same in the pig and poultry world, though. It's a main driver in the pig and poultry industry is striving ever increasing efficiency, and it's sometimes comes with a bit of a cost in terms of what we're asking from the animal, but it's something that is ultimately continuously driving down carbon footprint and environmental footprint, And a recent study that was published a couple of weeks ago looked at how far has the pig industry already come, and by going back something like 40 years of data, you can see the cumulative benefit of breeding on this, and that will continue. What we would like is an acceleration here and there, but it is certainly going in that direction.
Nicola, Gemma, do you want to say anything about the genomic side of that?
I think I would agree with what's been said, and it kind of goes back to what Robert said earlier as well about the win-win. So efficiency, definitely selecting for efficiency will improve the outputs, the methane emissions as well. But I think it also might be there's been some work done on looking at current indexes and how they would affect greenhouse gas emissions in future. It might be that weightings would need to change if that was your main driver, rather than the current kind of desired gains in a genetic index or the economic indexes. They may have different weightings. So the work that we did on hill sheep, although there's a negative weighting in the index already on mature size, similar to what Robert said about the cows, that was still increasing with the weightings that are currently on increased lamb growth rates. So if your main goal was to reduce the methane emissions, you would have to put a heavier penalty on the mature size and maybe take a bit of a hit on the lamb production. So it takes a kind of global view across all your different traits within your selection index. But definitely genomics could play a big role in that to get more information across more herds or flocks on these sort of traits that are really quite difficult to measure.
Okay. Robert, I'm going to pick on you again, and there's a question from Naomi, and it is, has there been a slaughter weight or cow size identified currently that maximises farm profit while minimising greenhouse gas emissions on farm?
So, really good question, one that I don't have a concrete answer to. I think the one thing is it does vary from farm to farm and system to system. So there are parts of the country where a smaller cow is certainly more advantageous. Certainly if you go up the west coast and go to the islands, you'll end up with particularly small and very efficient cows. And you go to stronger parts of the country, stronger land, you can stand a heavier cow. Probably the one, I'm not promoting a massive, whole scale total change in what the suckler cow looks like. Probably you're in that 650 kilo bracket, where you've got a reasonable cow efficiency. So the lighter the cow is, a smaller cow will wean more of her body weight, a higher proportion of her body weight as a calf. But you also have to have a saleable product at the end of it. So your 650 kilo cow certainly is producing something that's going to be, she's reasonably efficient to keep herself, and her output, her end product is a decent sized carcass as well. So all about balance, politicians' answer there, but yeah, in that 650 kilo bracket. But again, it's also not about coming to that absolute target for everybody to hit. It's more, have a look at what your cow weights are, have a look at what, where are the outliers in your herd, and go and find those big ladies that are big isn't beautiful anymore, that find those inefficiencies in your own herd and try and drag them down to a more a tighter average.
I guess another thing to bring in there is the sort of environmental advantages and disadvantages of your farm to what size suits as well, isn't it?
Yeah, there can't be a one size fits all suckler cow for Scotland.
Next up, I think this is maybe between Gemma and Julian. It's a question from Martin. For forestry, is there a time gap between planting and time the trees start sequestering carbon, or is it a break-even point?
I guess the trees are sequestering most carbon when they're growing at their most rapid speed. I guess when they're saplings, they're quite small, they're not sequestering much carbon. As they get bigger and develop more of a trunk, that's when they're really drawing in a lot of carbon. Yeah, obviously there comes a point where they mature and they're not sequestering anymore in the actual tree, but they are putting carbon into the soil as well through root exudates and litter fall and things like that. So I don't know if there's a break-even point, but yeah, there's definitely a sort of bell-shaped curve in terms of rate of carbon sequestration.
It's just worth saying that the carbon credits for planting trees have kind of diverged. So you get a low rate if you sort of sell the carbon the trees are going to capture in the future but haven't done yet, and you get a higher rate if you wait till the trees have actually captured some carbon. Because as you say, it does take years, so it's kind of 5-year, 10-year intervals. So you've actually got nothing to sell to start with until the trees have started to capture that. But that's starting to be reflected in the prices for carbon.
Nicola, we've got one for you from Walter. Is it possible that your studies in methane production may just show up differences in rumen capacity within breeds and between breeds, or are there likely to be other variations?
Yes, I think the rumen capacity is part of the story, but I don't think it's the whole story, and we definitely didn't see a relationship of one in that graph between rumen size and methane emissions. So I think that more research is needed really to understand that, and the information from the microbiome studies, they've seen really quite good accuracies at predicting methane from the microbiome in the rumen. So I don't think it's just to do with the size of the rumen, but there's a lot to do with the function of the microbiome as well as the function of the rumen itself. Yes, I think it's quite a complex story, and it may be that we don't want to select for just for rumen capacity, but there may be animals that break that positive correlation that we can almost select within an index to maintain rumen capacity but reduce methane emissions if we know all the information.
Okay, so very complex area.
Yeah.
Next, Gemma again. This is a question from Vic, and it is, what is the emissions difference between spreading farmyard manure straight from the shed rather than allowing to rot before spreading?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I guess I would think the emissions would be slightly higher because they're a bit more volatile when they're fresh. But no, I don't have a definitive answer for that. Julian, do you know anything about in that area?
It's not a total speciality, but obviously the sooner you get it in the ground, under the ground, then it's actually going to be useful to the plants. So if you leave it in a heap, I might be wrong, but the longer leaving it certainly outside in a heap, you're going to lose more nitrogen off it if you leave it too long. So you want to use it at the right time of year, not leave it lying around.
It's maybe one, Vic, I can come back to you. I've got your contact details, so I can find out and I can come back with a firm answer for you for that one. We have another one here, and I think this is a Nicola question. Do you think the EVVs in the texels could be getting distorted by embryo transfer with recipient yows, impacting on a lamb's weight gain from birth, where maternal impacts and traits from the pure yow are not shown in the lamb's performance?
Yep, I read that one. I think from as far as I understand it, the way it's treated in the genetic evaluations, they do split that up. So there's a genetic mother in the data set and there's a rearing mother in the data set. So they would then take the genetic component from the from the genetic mother and the sire, but any sort of environmental impact of the rearing mother is also accounted for. So it hopefully is teased apart in that way, and the genetic component in the EBV is just covering the actual genetic side rather than the rearing dam side as well.
Could be a controversial question, that one.
Mm-hmm.
Jos, back to you. How do you find the consistency of the diet when a protein source is grown with a companion crop?
Yeah, I saw that question. In the trial work where the protein source were grown with companion crops, that was not for the purpose of feeding it to pigs or poultry. That was an look-see to see if that could potentially be a useful way to generate interesting novel whole crop silages and other kind of feed opportunities. It's an interesting question, though, if we could develop a system where barley and beans are harvested at the same time into a mixture that goes into chicken or pig feed. My worry is that they will probably not be at the right kind of dryness at the same time. So that was not necessarily for pig and poultry. If the question is also how do feeds feel, handle, etc. When there is high levels of peas and beans in it, you don't notice a difference. When it's in a pellet, it's in a pellet.
Okay, thank you. I think this is possibly Julian. I'm going to fire this one at. Is there any research out there that shows that ruminant production can actually have a net carbon reduction?
Well, that's quite a big question. I think the thing we're trying to sort of practically find out is, having if you compare an arable rotation with livestock in it and one without, usually there's a lot of benefits from the livestock being in the rotation, certainly bringing the grass into the rotation. I mean, that certainly in the UK, it's hard to see livestock necessarily being carbon ruminants, quite a long way off being carbon neutral, but they can certainly have positive effects for the wider system of farming. And I think it's not always easy to capture that, but that's sort of being missed sometimes. People are talking about livestock in one breath and arable crops in another, but actually they do work together effectively to bring down the overall emissions. But yeah, that's quite a difficult question to actually say. You know, grazing animals could be zero, but maybe Gemma's. Well, you're obviously looking at this, aren't
you? Yeah, I mean, I think with methane emissions, it would be difficult to ever argue that livestock will ever bring us down to net zero, but it can be offset in other ways on a farm.
I think there's a lot of people out there looking for, you know, a silver bullet that is us saying that actually soil sequesters more carbon than the methane that's produced from your livestock, and that's all fine. So then we don't have to do anything, we don't have to change anything. But actually, we're beyond that. You know, if your house is on fire, but you're not the person that smokes, you didn't set the house on fire, you would try and put the fire out. So in this case, you know, we've got genuinely got a global climate issue, and we've all got a responsibility to reduce emissions. So whether we're developing better and better ways of measuring carbon and quantifying it, but actually if we can make reductions in emissions anyway, we should get on and do it.
Jos, do you want to add anything?
Well, yeah, I remember what you said earlier, Robert, about a farm in the red can't be green. And I think that is a very nice observation to say that anything where you can make improvements in terms of carbon efficiency, you probably also in the long run will improve your farm efficiency. So that and I personally think that very often the kind of messages are perhaps a bit scary because it feels like we need lots of things need to happen, etc., and perhaps a bit of investment need to happen, but ultimately it will or it should overall improve farm efficiency, which therefore in that way to some extent will pay back. Whether it is over the short term or the long term is perhaps another discussion. So yeah, that's what I wanted to add.
Okay, we've got 3 minutes left. We've got quite a few questions, so rather than tasking the questions, if we could have one key take-home message from each of you, please. And I'm going to start with the first speaker, Julian.
Okay, so excuse me, sorry. Yeah, it's hard to get away. You know, there is a business benefit from reducing carbon, and you don't necessarily have to believe in it, I suppose, or exactly livestock's role in the whole thing. But there are clear business benefits, whether it's improving your ability to obtain support or to obtain a contract for the sale of your products, and also find efficiency savings. So I think there's plenty of reasons to do it.
Robert?
I was just going to piggyback on Julian's. I think the one thing is be positive. You know, the future, you look at where we are as a livestock industry at the moment, the job's good, and you know, the job is fine. Change is coming, but change isn't all bad. Be positive. I think when new policies come in, we need to embrace them and make it happen.
Gemma?
I guess I'm going to just build a bit on what Robert just said there, is that Scottish agriculture does have a really positive environmental story to tell already. There's some negative press, but I think it's not always completely true. And we can do better. There's a lot of wins to still be had. and we can definitely get there.
Nicola?
And I would just back what everybody else has said, and I think we're understanding more of the issues more all the time with some of the research and the studies that have been going on, and I think everybody in the whole is kind of coming along with it as well. So I think just to keep going in the same direction, increase the information that we're getting out to people, and hopefully we can make differences.
Last but not least, Jos.
Well, mine is more a plea rather than a take-home message. I think work at our research, but also elsewhere, is clearly showing that provided that we have more of our homegrown protein sources available, we can certainly use them. So let's promote at governmental level incentives for farmers to achieve that rather than stoppages, because I believe in incentives rather than in, I believe in carrots rather than sticks. Thank you.
Super, thank you. And that sums it up just perfectly, I think. There's some really on point messages there, all following on from the others. So some great things and some fantastic talks there. So thank you to all of you for speaking and for everybody for joining us today. We've had a really, really big crowd today, and it just shows the importance of climate change and how much of a top topic it is at the moment. We've been funded today by University Innovation Fund for the Scottish Funding Council, so I'd just like to thank our funders as well. And we have got another session at the start of June on future livestock, looking at new technologies. So we'll send the link for that round to everybody who's been on today. So that just leaves me to say thank you once more, and we will see you all later. Thanks now.